Okay, hello everybody. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the Turrbal and Jagera peoples as traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which we meet today, lands which were never ceded. On behalf of everyone here and the institution for which I work, the University of Queensland, I would like to pay respect to the Turrbal and Jagera peoples, their ancestors and their descendants, and their cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society and stand with them in solidarity. I'd also like to extend that acknowledgement to the traditional owners and custodians of the various lands from which you join us today. Okay, welcome to the second lecture in the 2023 Plants, People and the Law lecture series. One of the aims of the lecture series is to bring together some of the most important intellectual figures of the last 40 years working on plants in a legal context. Another aim is to showcase some of the best work happening currently in this area. We've been running for 2 years now, and you can find the details and recordings of last year's lectures on the lecture series website. You can also find there the details of the next 2 lectures coming up this year. Please do join us. A couple of quick points of housekeeping. If you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A section. We'll do our best to get to some of them after the talk. If the Q&A or chat sections fail, please use my email, which you should have in the registration details. In today's lecture, we're showcasing some of the most exciting work currently being undertaken on the history of plants, people, and the law. Our speaker today is Dr. Kjell Ericson, and he's joining us from the University of Kyoto. There are a number of reasons why we're excited to hear more about Dr. Ericson's work. The first is that Dr. Ericson's work explores plants, people, and the law in motion. That is, both changing and moving. Another is that Dr. Ericson's work draws attention to plant patent legislation beyond the United States 1930 Plant Patent Act. And another is that this work is part of a broader interest of Dr. Ericson's in histories of migration, colonialism, agriculture, aquaculture, and intellectual property. So, on one hand, it's the themes. On another hand, it's the subject matter. And on a third hand, it's the broader context in which he situates his work, which look to us to be the features of an exciting research school in the making. That's enough from me. I'd like to hand over to Dr. Kjell Ericson now, who will be speaking today on reconsidering Japan's plant patent movement, national histories, colonial legacies, and Transpacific dynamics. I'll hand over to you now. Thank you ever so much, Dr. Ericson.
Okay, thank you very much, Barris, and I hope everyone can hear me. Let me just allow me to share my screen. Is everyone able to see the first slide on my screen?
That's coming through brilliantly, thanks.
Okay, so once again, hello everybody. My name is Kjell Ericson. I'm a historian here at Kyoto University. I'd like to thank both Barris and Brad Sherman and everyone at the center for inviting me to present in this wonderful series. So let me begin by introducing a court case. So in a 2000 ruling, Japan's High Court affirmed that crossbreeding methods to produce new plant varieties could in principle be claimed under Japanese patent law. The object of that ruling was a yellow peach, named in a patent application submitted 23 years earlier by a Tokyo fruit breeder named Kurakata Eizo. Since its long-awaited approval in 1988, the Kurakata peach patent inspired widespread opposition from horticultural and fruit tree seed dealer associations across Japan. The case attracted commentary in Japanese legal circles, in part because it tested a key tenet of patent law in Japan and elsewhere, that an industrial invention must be replicable. could plants derived from breeding crosses count as inventions? Japan's High Court suggested that they could. One commentator, who would later serve as chief judge in Japan's intellectual property High Court, noted that, quote, "This is the first ruling on the replicability of plant patents by the court, so its meaning is significant." She added that, quote, "In the future, this will extend a large influence over issues, including the legal protection of new biotechnologies," unquote. Now, 2 decades on, the Kurakata yellow peach case appears as more of a kind of cul-de-sac than a harbinger of a wider trend towards plant patents. Today, fruits, flowers, and other plants are exclusively owned and authored in Japan without applying for patents of invention at the Japanese Patent Office. Instead, people register new plant varieties at Japan's Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fisheries. The main focus of recent discussions about and opposition to plant variety protection tend not to dwell on the issue of patents. Plant variety protections are now firmly based outside Japan's patent office. My interest in the Kurakata yellow peach has as much to do with what it tells us about the 20th century as the 21st. So we could take the figure of Kurakata Eizo himself. Kurakata was a Tokyo-based fruit breeder in the late 20th century, but he also played an earlier and directly related 1930s and 1940s role as a settler colonist in the southern Korean peninsula during the period of Japanese colonial rule. Kurakata's yellow peach variety was born of plant germplasm that had circulated within Asia and across the Pacific. Kurakata and his yellow peach were part of colonial and post-colonial biogeographies of orchard fruit breeding and growing, along with shifting legal geographies of plant ownership. Crucially, Kurakata and his yellow peach were connected to a 1970s moment of lobbying for new plant varieties to be treated as patentable inventions. Kurakata was a member of the association at the center of this 1970s plant patent movement, which in English is styled as the Japan Campaign for the Promotion on a Plant Patent Law. Thus far, historians and other legal scholars have not paid much attention to this group, which is, for the most part, hardly mentioned beyond recollections of some of its former members. In part, this is because many of the group's members saw the group's movement end in setback with the establishment of a reformed plant variety protection system under the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fisheries. So following an organism like the Kurakata yellow peach brings attention to multiple and often overlapping transplantations of fruit tree germplasm, people, and ideas of property ownership. My suggestion is that plant patenting provides a window onto histories of fruit, flower, and vegetable breeding within and beyond the Japanese archipelago. The 20th century story of plant patenting also links to a burst of research into the legacies of settler colonialism among Japanese agricultural migrants living in but also beyond Japan's formal colonial empire. One such settler was Kurakata Eizo, who promoted his yellow peach as a living connection to his time in colonial Korea. The first 2 sections of today's talk reconsider Japanese institutional and legal histories of industrial property and plant variety protection before the 1970s. The following 2 sections shift our focus onto the plant movement, the formerly mentioned JCPPPL, and the transformation of plant variety protection in 1970s Japan. The final section redirects attention to Kurakata Eizo and his yellow peaches, resituating plant patenting issues within but also beyond courtrooms and ministerial offices. Okay, so the 1970s plant patent movement was part of longer questions about the Japanese Patent Office's purview over, quote, industrial property. The question of what counted as industrial and thus patentable or unpatentable gained residence upon Meiji Japan's 1899 accession to the Paris Convention for the Protection of Industrial Property. In contemporaneous European and American legal circles, industrial property was a category that could, in principle, extend to the realms of the agricultural and mineralogical. But the concept of industrial property took on different associations in the language of imperial Japanese law. One reason for this was the very term chosen as the Japanese language gloss for the industrial of the Paris Convention's formulation of industrial property, kogyo. In Japan, the industry of kogyo denoted a field that stood in contrast to agriculture, or nogyo, Depending on context, industrial kogyo was agricultural no-gyo's opposite. Changes to the geopolitical boundaries of industrial property protection followed Japan's 1899 accession to the Paris Convention. The legal regime after 1899 allowed people outside the Japanese Empire to apply for Japanese patents through the mediation of Japanese patent lawyers. The transformation of post-1899 industrial property law in turn led to efforts in Japanese courts to circumscribe the range of inventions that could be patented by foreign claimants. This was the case in 1903 when Japan's High Court ruled that a claim could not receive a patent as a novel invention if it had been, quote, publicly known or publicly used within the Japanese Empire. Left unstated was the status of inventors in Japan's colonies, who operated under the same patent law, but did not in practice, as Jung Lee and others have argued, receive the same protections. The boundaries of industry as kogyo in early 20th century Japanese industrial property law came into dispute in a few cases involving patents with agricultural and fisheries applications. One concerned a method authored by an entrepreneur called Mikimoto Kokichi for inducing the formation of semi-spherical pearls in living shellfish. The patent covered a step in the production of what were then sold as culture pearls, namely the preparation and treatment of nucleating objects that would be inserted between the inner layer of a pearl oyster's shell and its flesh. A Japanese imperial high court ruling held in 1911 that the pearl patent could count as an industrial process because it made use of natural side effects through human artifice. The civil trials in the pearl patent dispute reinterpreted industrial property in terms of the application of human artifice to the laws of nature. This was a logic that would resurface in ensuing attempts to justify industrial property in agricultural and fisheries realms. So amid cases like the pearl patent controversy, some legal commentators in Japan began to criticize the meanings of industry encompassed by kogyo in Japanese patent law. In the late 1930s, one legal scholar described the term as, quote, an infelicitous word choice bordering on mistranslation, unquote. By that time, an alternative Japanese language formulation of industry had already been proposed by a team of legal officials sent from Tokyo in the mid-1930s to the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo. The 1936 Manchukuo Patent and Invention Law introduced a conception of industrial property that its Japanese drafters intended to go beyond patent law in the Japanese Empire. Notable was the law's wording of industry as sangyo, rather than kogyo, as in Japanese imperial law. The existing terminology of industry as kogyo had what the authors described as a narrow meaning. By contrast, they stressed that the Manchukuo law employed the, quote, comprehensive phrasing, unquote, of industrial invention denoted by the term sangyo. A broadened conception of industry as sangyo made its way into Japan's 1959 patent law, the first wholesale revision of Japanese industrial property legislation since 1921. The newer patent law remains on the books in an amended form, but it reflected earlier changes inside and outside the Japanese Empire. It began with an explicit definition of invention as, quote, the highly advanced creation of technical ideas utilizing the laws of nature, unquote. The protection of invention was in turn framed as a way to support the development of industry, expressed in terms of sangyo rather than kogyo. As the Patent Office's 100th anniversary in-house history put it, the post-1959 choice of sangyo for industry had, quote, borrowed from the example of the establishment of Manchukuo's patent law, unquote. So patent protection in Japan continued to be shaped by past legal disputes and institutional remnants of war and empire in ways that would have ongoing implications for inventive claims that purported to be both industrial and agricultural, or for that matter, aquacultural. Yet patentable cultivation was circumscribed in terms of processes for raising plants and animals, or in the case of pearl cultivation, for modifying living shellfish. The idea of extending patent protection to living organisms as such brought new questions about the social and legal boundaries of industrial property. This was certainly the case when it came to plants. So as we've just seen, the first half of the 20th century saw shifts toward conceptions of industrial property that did not exist in tension with or in opposition to agriculture. Nor had these debates existed in a vacuum. Agricultural scientists, lawyers, and horticultural breeders in the Japanese Empire took notice of legal changes in the early 20th century world. The 1930 American Plant Patent Act inspired curiosity and critique in Japan, as elsewhere, almost immediately after the law's passage. The act, which created rights protecting the asexual or vegetative propagation of plant varieties, appealed to fruit and especially flower breeders in Japan. Proponents such as the Tokyo Imperial University agricultural scientist Noguchi Yakichi introduced Japanese language readers to the law and suggested that Japan adopt a plant protection system along similar lines. However, the plant patenting debate shifted after 1945. In 1946, Japan's reconstituted patent office hosted 2 conferences that floated the idea of introducing an American-style plant patenting system. Among the attendees was the aforementioned scientist Noguchi Yakichi. Officials with the Patent Office and Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry concluded that amid widespread food shortages and ongoing discussions about agricultural land reform, it was too early to pass a plant patent law. Instead, plant variety protection took shape under the 1947 Agricultural Seeds and Seedlings Law. The law outlined the registration of the names of new plant varieties through the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry, not the Patent Office. So it's important here to note that the Seeds and Seedlings Law had not emerged from concerted plant breeder lobbying. Contemporaneous explanations of the law stressed goals of promoting the distribution of high-quality seeds and the stamping out of so-called unscrupulous seed dealers, rather than the protection of breeders per se. This was both a diagnosis of early post-war Japan, but also along the lines of research by scholars like Abe Nozomi, part of longer questions of trust and wholesale distribution in the 19th and 20th century seed trades. Ultimately, the 1947 law was something closer to a trademark registration system, albeit with protections that lasted between 3 and 10 years, which was a shorter period of time than for a trademark. So at this point, it's worth mentioning longer-term relationships between publicly funded crop breeding and private horticultural research. The Japanese state promoted research into staple crop variety improvement and the distribution of seeds before and after 1945. In recent years, historians including Fujihara Tatsushi, Manyoung Moon, Taeho Kim, and Hiromi Mizuno have shed light on connections between the Japanese Empire and the intra-imperial and post-1945 spread of crop cultivars. This kind of work has revealed the central role of agriculture in the Japanese Empire and post-colonial Asia to our conventional understandings of the Green Revolution. Research laboratories attached to prefectural and colonial governments, as well as the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry, or the NOTO, pursued several strands of staple crop breeding, including the widely adopted Taichung 65 variety of Ponlai or Hodai rice. Another project led to the development of shorter stalked wheat plants that grew quickly and could survive in cold and windy areas. One product of this research was Norin 10, or Agriculture and Forestry 10, a high-yielding wheat variety that later became part of Norman Borlaug's hitherto better-known wheat breeding research and Green Revolution narratives. The 1947 Agricultural Seeds and Seedlings Law treated staple crop research in public research institutions separately from other kinds of plant breeding activities. Notably, the new law came to include rice, wheat, barley, soy, and other plant organisms classified as staples under the 1952 Main Crop Seeds Law. To be sure, divisions between staple and ornamental breeding were not always clear-cut in state-funded academic research. For example, Ida Kaori and others have shown how the Kyoto University geneticist Kihara Hitoshi worked with plant organisms, including wheat and watermelon, in his well-known research into polyploidy. Such often publicly funded research continued, but the post-1947 legal framework of plant protection, along with formalized post-1952 divisions between staple crops and other plant varieties, would, as Hisano Shuji and others have noted, shape commercial plant breeding interests through the 1980s and to some extent beyond. So up through that point, the largest Japanese seed companies like Taki or Sakata continued to focus for the most part on fruits, garden vegetables, and flowers. Okay, so for nearly 3 decades, the 1947 Agricultural Seeds and Seedlings Act was the only option for plant variety protection in post-war Japan. But by the late 1960s, hints of dissatisfaction with the existing plant varietal registration system grew louder. So calls for a new formulation of plant ownership took form in a special feature in the March 1970 issue of the magazine Nooko to Enge, known as English as the Agriculturist and Horticulturist. Participants in the special feature described a fundamentally flawed agricultural seeds and seedlings law. Plant breeders argued that the time and costs required to develop new varieties deserved a longer period of protection. They said the existing system did little to restrict the cultivation and sale of registered plants. This special feature pressed the case for an alternative suggested in its title, which is actually not visible in this slide. What our country also wants, a plant patent law. The also in the title was not trivial. Calls for a new approach to plant protection appeared in Japan amid parallel changes in North America and Europe. In Western Europe, the convention of the International Union for the Protection of New Varieties of Plants, or UPOV, had gone into effect in 1968, nearly 7 years after the union's formation. In the United States, the Department of Agriculture administered Plant Variety Protection Act of 1970 would extend protection to sexually reproduced plant varieties, not just the asexual methods encompassed by the 1930 Plant Patent Act. The point is that in the early 1970s, the range of possibilities suggested by the idea of a plant patent was beginning to include a wider variety of protection systems, including some that existed outside patent offices and the legal form of the utility patent. After the 1970 Agriculturist and Horticulturist special issue, a series of publications, meetings, and lectures followed. In July 1971, several dozen members formed the Shokubutsu Tokkyo-ho Seitei Sokushin Kyogikai, a group known in English, again, as the Japan Campaign for the Promotion on a Plant Patent Law, or JCPPPL. It's quite a mouthful. So this JCPPPL was led by Shisa Makoto, a retired Nagoya University agricultural scientist with interests in floral biology. Shisa had worked on tropical botany in colonial Taiwan during the wartime 1930s and 1940s in Taipei and later in Taichung. He later took up positions at various universities in Japan after 1945. So he had wide connections to botanists and breeders across Japan and beyond. He was above all a person who brought a sense of academic credibility to the association's activities. Shisa's most prominent recruit to the JCPPPL was his former schoolmate, Sakomizu Hisatsune, a bureaucrat and politician who would serve as the JCPPPL's chairman. Sakomizu emphasized the group's trans-war and ongoing post-war links to Japan's conservative leadership. Sakomizu had worked in the highest echelons of the Japanese Empire's wartime bureaucracy, overseeing financial control policies alongside formerly Manchukuo-posted officials as a section chief in the Public Finance Bureau of the Finance Ministry. Along with other so-called wartime imperial reform bureaucrat officials, Sakomizu returned to a substantial leadership role in post-war Japan as a liberal Democratic Party politician. Membership came from other directions too. The agriculturist and horticulturist journal editor Uemura Naoyuki and the patent official Ikenoya Kinichi both took active roles in the organization. Ikenoya, pictured here, was a key figure in situating a Japanese plant patent movement within past and parallel efforts at plant variety protection elsewhere in the world, which for him centered primarily on Europe and the United States. Kihara Hitoshi, the then retired Kyoto University professor central to the formation of genetics as an agriculturally focused discipline in Japan, in large part through studies of wheat and other plants, joined the group as an advisor. Other members included the plant breeder Shinohara Suteki, who recalled in the early 1970s that he had first learned about the US Plant Patent Act from the previously mentioned Noguchi Yakichi around 1932. After Shinohara's graduation, he worked at the Sakata Seed Company. Along the way, he participated in wartime botanical surveys in China from 1939. Shinohara returned to Japan with over 150 varieties of seeds and began what he later called his serious breeding work, in part with germplasm the survey had brought from mainland China. In 1940, Sakata Seed introduced a cabbage variety called the Suteki Kannan, named, of course, after Shinohara Suteki. which the company would bill as the world's first F1 hybrid cabbage seeds. At the core of the JCPPPL was a community of commercial flower breeders. One of the loudest voices was Suzuki Seizo, later known in Japan as Mr. Rose, and you can see him here with some of those roses. Shisa and Suzuki both argued in print that Japanese horticulturists were developing an international reputation as purveyors of pirated or kaizokuban flowers that had been propagated in bulk by using cuttings of varieties protected in the United States and Europe. Without a strong plant patent law, they argued, legal imports of new floral varieties from abroad would dry up. The JCPPPL's leaders were conscious of the prominent roles played by plant breeder and seed company lobbies in the creation of plant protection laws elsewhere, particularly in the United States. Members of groups like the American Seed Trade Association made trips to Japan in the early 1970s to push for new plant variety protections with an eye to United States agricultural exports to Japan. Along with them came Stanley Rollin, an official with the US Department of Agriculture, who then headed the Plant Variety Protection Office. During the 1970s, the group enlisted figures in American and European horticultural and floricultural trades. Among them was Paul Eck, the poinsettia king of California, who amplified the piracy narrative by condemning what he saw as the rampant illicit propagation of flowers in Japan. The JCPPPL used critics like Eck to reinforce claims that mechanisms of plant protection were necessary. At the same time, the leader Shisa Makoto stressed to Japanese-speaking audiences that under different legal circumstances, these accusations of piracy might have gone in the opposite direction. Stronger plant protection, argued Shisa, offered a way for fruit and ornamental flower breeders to avoid repeating the vast and largely unremunerated transfers of plant germplasm that had moved to California and elsewhere in the late 19th and early 20th century world. The JCPPPL was not a mass movement by any means, but it promoted different aspects of plant variety protection to different audiences. The group opened branch sites and held study sessions in different parts of Japan, with the goal of raising support for monopoly plant variety protection systems among breeders, growers, agricultural researchers, and local leaders. But the group's core lobbying activities remained centered in Tokyo. In January 1975, Sakomizu delivered a petition on behalf of the JCPPPL to the Minister of Agriculture and Forestry. The petition laid out a proposal for a new plant protection law. It gestured toward the 1968 ratification of the UPOV Convention in Western Europe and the 1970 passage of the Plant Variety Protection Act in the United States. It claimed that other countries had legislated plant protections with, quote, rights identical to those for industrial patents and copyrighted works, unquote, but argued that, quote, today Japan is completely isolated from global trends, unquote. The petition went on to state that Japanese agriculture was unable to profit from the export of improved varieties while being hindered from plant importation. Intriguingly, the JCPPPL called for the protection of all forms of plant cultivation, whether asexual propagation through cuttings or sexual reproduction through seeds. As with systems like the American Plant Variety Protection Act, the group requested evaluation standards based not on utility, but rather novelty, uniformity, and stability over a longer period of protection that they proposed for up to 15 years. So the JCPPPL had formed as a way to call for reform of Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry systems of plant variety registration, but also as a group lobbying for the Japanese Patent Office to take a larger role in the governance of new plant varieties. The twist was that plant variety governance was not happening in patent offices elsewhere in the world, not even for the most part in the 1970s United States, where the new Plant Variety Protection Act was under the purview of people like Stanley Rollin at the Department of Agriculture. Okay. So the mid-1970s saw a major shift in the plant variety protection debate in Japan. The Japanese Patent Office pursued reforms to allow patents not only for processes, but also for products. So this shift is probably better known for its role in reshaping drug patenting practices in the Japanese pharmaceutical industry. But in November 1975, newspapers carried stories about another related change to Patent Office evaluation standards. patent officials announced that plant varieties would also be able to receive patent protection like any other industrial invention. The Japan Patent Office's 1975 announcement in turn prompted Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry officials to speed up the drafting of a competing plant variety protection system. To agriculture and forestry officials, the Patent Office's plant variety evaluation standards were a bid to play an unwanted larger role in agricultural regulation. So agriculture and forestry officials wrote draft legislation as a revision of the earlier 1947 Agricultural Seeds and Seedlings Law. The Japanese Diet passed the draft in 1978, which went into effect under the shortened title of the Seeds and Seedlings Law. The Seeds and Seedlings Law's revised system of plant variety registration remained within the bureaucratic orbit of agriculture and forestry, not the Patent Office. Even so, the new law had initial cross-agency support. With the Seeds and Seedlings Law, some of the JCPPPL's members also sensed that the Patent Office was beginning to lose interest in the prospect of plant patents altogether. Nevertheless, the Patent Office's 1975 plant patent evaluation standards did not go away with the revised 1978 law and Japan's subsequent accession to the UPOV Convention in 1982. Interministerial controversies over plant patenting left lasting and mutually unresolved institutional mandates to authorize and govern plant-related claims. Simply put, ambiguity about the patentability of plants created openings for dispute. So the late 1970s situation dissatisfied many in the JCPPPL. Some members were happy with the 1978 Seeds and Seedlings Law's provisions for longer protection periods than the previous 1947 legislation. But concerns remained that the new agriculture and forestry-centered system had not been designed with breeder interests in mind. Even so, Japan's plant patent lobby lost steam after the passage of the 1978 law. By 1981, the JCPPPL had dissolved after nearly a decade in existence. One of the most disappointed ex-members was Kurakata Eizo, then a fruit breeder in his mid-70s. Kurakata was born to a landowning Tokyo family in 1906. From an early age, Kurakata harbored dreams of fruit breeding. Indeed, the first mention of Kurakata that I found so far is a 1931 roundtable in the journal Shokumin, or the Colonial Review, which brought together a recent Japanese returnee from Argentina and a group of young men who hoped to migrate to South America. But Kurakata quickly abandoned his Argentina-bound plans. Instead, around 1933, he joined a tide of migrants from the Japanese archipelago who settled in the Korean peninsula, then part of the Japanese colonial empire. Kurakata operated a fruit farm in Ulsan County to the north of the port city of Busan, after consulting a Japanese library for areas of the Korean peninsula with climates, quote, similar to that of California, unquote. The means by which he acquired land is unclear, but Kurakata's time in Korea loomed large in his recollections as a time when he undertook the growing of apples, persimmons, and peaches. Over and over, Kurakata repeated accounts of his time as a fruit-growing settler in 1930s Korea. He spoke in a language of pioneer orchard capitalism, recalling how he had used dynamite to prepare the land in Ulsan for planting. Kurakata later claimed that he had been repatriated from Korea to Tokyo in 1945 with little more than a few hundred seeds, some of which he used to grow what he called an early ripening white peach. Kurakata came into wider public view as a critic of the 1947 Agricultural Seeds and Seedlings Law. Kurakata recounted difficulties in protecting his claims to the early ripening white peach, which he had registered under the law in 1951. From his perspective, the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry was uninterested in enforcing the law within Japan. By the early 1960s, Kurakata was calling for more substantial plant protections. His early ripening white peach also headlined the JCPPPL's lobbying activities in the early 1970s. Leader Shisa Makoto brought up the Kurakata peach as an example of the limitations of the Agricultural Seeds and Seedlings Law. Shisa noted that Kurakata had received no compensation for the earlier spread of his varietal, ironically in 1950s and 1960s Argentina, where Shisa noted that, quote, most of the peaches are Kurakata early ripening, unquote. From the perspective of JCPPPL leaders, Kurakata fit an idea of lone Japanese breeders amid charges of foreign influence or larger companies that also hope to benefit from reforms in the law. Kurakata himself also discussed narratives of the Green Revolution that were emerging around the figure of the American Norman Borlaug. Kurakata pointed out that pre-war wheat breeders in northern Japan had developed dwarf wheat varieties later taken up by Borlaug and others. Kurakata's point, however, was less that breeders in the Japanese Empire had been overlooked in global accounts than that the individual scientists in Japan had not received any special monetary reward for their work. All the while, Kurakata, like Shisa and others at the JCPPPL, downplayed their own legacies of bioprospecting and biopiracy. Kurakata continued to criticize the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry's administration of plant variety protection under the Seeds and Seedlings Law. He argued that, quote, breeders' rights are not expressed whatsoever in the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry's latest plant protection law, unquote. So Kurakata used another peach variety as a test organism for alternatives to the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry-centered plant variety protection system. Kurakata credited his Korean interlude not just for the then well-known early ripening white peach, but also for a newer variety of yellow canning peach. He claimed to have first obtained the latter in 1977, after what he calculated as 44 years of breeding work that he timed from his 1930s sojourn in colonial Korea. Kurakata wanted a yellow peach suitable for canning. As historian Michael Thornton has traced, the late 19th century witnessed an intensification of state efforts to bring orchard fruits to Meiji Japan, particularly to colonial Hokkaido. Several decades later, Kurakata's time in Korea overlapped with a burst of Transpacific Japanese settler colonial interest in fruit canning. This was most notable in the context of fisheries expansion, but canning also extended to ideas for canning agricultural produce. By the 1920s, the canning of yellow peach varieties had also grown dramatically elsewhere in the world, particularly in California. So we have to recall that this was in the wake of the 1924 United States Immigration Act, which prevented prospective Japanese migrants like Kurakata from starting up orchards in North America. In 1930s Korea and after 1945 in Japan, Kurakata developed ideas of breeding new varieties of canning peaches. He was part of a larger pattern of settler colonial migration that Eiichiro Azuma has described in terms of borderless empire, in which plans for agricultural settlement extended across the Pacific, but which also reverberated across Asia, all the while being shaped by racist immigration restrictions and exclusions. Kurakata's yellow peach made use of other varieties that had circulated through agricultural experiment stations in the Japanese Empire, such as the Georgia Alberta peach, and the canning Tuscan peach, once popular in California. In the years after 1945, Kurakata crossbred the Tuscan and Alberta varieties to yield the yellow peach hybrid Tusberta. With the Tusberta, he crossed a peach variety that he would refer to in English language applications as Bankito. The Bankito was a material artifact of Kurakata's time in the Korean peninsula, where he claimed to have acquired and brought the variety to Tokyo in 1945. He described the Tusberta and the Bankito's progeny as yielding yellow fruits with a, quote, distinctive good flavor, unquote. So in the late 1970s, Kurakata pursued two avenues for laying claim to the late ripening yellow peach. The first was through the Japan Patent Office, where Kurakata submitted a patent application in 1977 for a Kurakata yellow peach. In 1978, he filed a second application in the United States under the 1930 Plant Patent Act, this time for a Kurakata yellow peach tree. Kurakata received approval for the American patent in 1979. The application with the Japan Patent Office, on the other hand, remained in limbo. The Kurakata yellow peach patent applications moved through the American and Japanese legal systems amid changes in the geopolitical role of patents as vehicles for making claims on living creatures. Told from the perspective of the United States, the global history of living organism protections unfolds both in terms of a broadening scope of claims, but also in terms of shifts in the administrative centers of their governance. The spotlight moves from the United States Patent Office administered 1930 Plant Patent Act to the Department of Agriculture's 1970 Plant Variety Protection Act, and then to a broadening of the Plant Variety Protection Office's purview, the Patent Office's purview, following the extension of patent rights to microorganisms, plants, and animals. During the 1980s, a series of American legal decisions stretched patent protection over creatures great and small. In the Diamond v. Chakrabarty case, the United States Supreme Court held that whether or not the genetically engineered bacteria in question was alive was irrelevant to the question of its patentability. In Japan, the Diamond v. Chakrabarty judgment dovetailed with Japan's 1982 accession to the International UPOV Convention on Plant Variety Protections to provoke a new round of fears about the effects of monopoly rights on global food supply chains. As in other parts of the 1980s world, some in Japan used the militarized metaphor of seed wars to describe ambiguously interstate and transnational battles for control of plant germplasm and their effects on farmers who relied on inexpensive seeds and customary practices of saving seeds for the next planting. It was in this context that tensions over biotechnology rights flared in the 1980s between the Patent Office and the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fisheries. One dispute concerned the Kyoto-based pharmaceutical company Nippon Shinyaku's patent applications for polyploid varieties of mugwort plants that the company had bred in order to yield increased quantities of centinin, a chemical used in treatments against parasitic worms. In 1985, the Japan Patent Office issued Japan's first plant variety patent for Nippon Shinyaku's polyploid mugwort. The acceptance was the first example of the Patent Office's broadened post-1975 efforts to extend its jurisdiction to plant patents. At the same time, Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry officials described the mugwort case as a one-off. They expected that the Patent Office would issue no further plant patents. As such, some saw the case as a dead end that would bar any future attempts by foreign companies to gain exclusive control of staple crop varieties through utility patents. The mugwort case indicated to a wide swath of observers that no patents for a plant variety would ever again be accepted by the Patent Office. The new round of interagency tensions came to a head in 1988 when the Patent Office actually approved Kurakata Eizo's revised yellow peach patent. By that time, Kurakata's claims had undergone a transformation by his representative, the former JCPPPL member Ikenoya Kinichi. Crucially, the patent's wording had changed by 1984 from a claim over a plant organism, the Kurakata yellow peach itself, into a claim over two cultivation processes, the breeding, or ikushu, and subsequent propagation, or zoushoku, of a yellow peach plant. The acceptance of the Kurakata patent concerned other breeders and farmers in Japan because it implied a wider scope of Japanese plant protection than anything available under the 1978 Seeds and Seedlings Law, or for that matter, under United States law. Several plant breeder and growers groups lodged complaints with the Patent Office. Their leaders called for support from farmers elsewhere in Japan. The groups made it clear that the patent case was about more than just a peach. They claimed that the dispute held in the balance not only the continued existence of the Seeds and Seedlings Law, but also agriculture writ large. In spite of their objections, Japan's High Court ruled in favor of Kurakata's patent in 2000, as we've already seen. The ruling was the first High Court decision to engage with the legacies of the Patent Office's 1975 attempt to expand the boundaries of patentable invention to include plant varieties. At issue was the revised wording of the Kurakata patent application, which in 1984 included claims over both the crossbreeding of a yellow peach variety and its ensuing asexual propagation. One oft-quoted passage in the ruling stated that, quote, if a new variety is bred, after that it can be reproduced through traditionally used propagation methods. If the breeding of a new variety is possible, even if the probability is low, one can offer this up as the technical effect that is the goal of the invention, unquote. In other words, the fact that the yellow peach tree had once existed was sufficient to assume that it could be reproduced in the future. But crucial barriers to the reproduction of the Kurakata yellow peach remained. This was because the Bankito, the parent peach tree that Kurakata had brought back to post-war Japan from his time in colonial Korea, somehow went missing in 1995. The patent application had also faced no requirements for the submission in advance of peach germplasm to the Japan Patent Office. The current lack of Bankito cultivars for future breeding experiments means that the, quote, low probability, unquote, of obtaining a Kurakata yellow peach via crossbreeding remains hypothetical. Although opponents of the Kurakata yellow peach patent lost their case, their outcry was muted. Compared to the situation in the 1980s and 1990s, agricultural observers in Japan had begun to see the case less as a harbinger of future monopoly strategies than as a curious outlier. Kurakata Eizo himself passed away before the High Court's 2000 ruling. Today, you can't find the Kurakata yellow peach in any seed catalogs. Nor did the 2000 ruling on Kurakata's yellow peach herald the start of widespread plant variety patenting through the Japan Patent Office. Efforts at plant protection have, if anything, moved closer to the orbit of the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fisheries. Contributing to lukewarm interest in plant patenting has been the strengthening of plant variety protections outside the realm of patent law. This was already apparent by 1998 when Japan adhered to the 1991 version of the UPOV Convention following a substantial revision of the 1978 Seeds and Seedlings Law. Plant patents, if perhaps possible, are not in practice applied for or granted. In part, this is because of continued reforms, again, in plant protections in favor of breeder rights in other forms. For example, the 2018 scrapping of the 1952 main crop seed law, which was also tied to negotiations over the Transpacific Partnership or TPP agreement, has made rice and grains potentially eligible for new monopoly protections. So multiple ironies surrounded the 2000 Kurakata yellow peach ruling. Although it did not signal a new round of plant patents, subsequent changes to the Seeds and Seedlings Act, notably a more recent 2020 revision, sometimes called the Monsanto Law, have also witnessed the arrival of strengthened plant breeder rights. One result is that it's now much harder for farmers in Japan to save seeds legally, even as the range of plant varieties that can receive protections has widened. Current plant variety protections are not the, quote, plant patents many JCPPPL members once championed, but the system now may not be as far apart as things might have seemed in the late 1970s. Likewise, we might need to consider the historical context for the continued trans-border focus of Japanese fruit and flower policies. Multiple regulations are centered on restricting the circulation of protected varieties of strawberries, pears, and many other varieties within Asia. We might also consider current policies in terms of longer trajectories of plants and people in motion that we've seen with Kurakata Eizo and his peaches. Okay, I'll just end with a few concluding thoughts that kind of return to my talk's title of National Histories, Colonial Legacies, and Transpacific Dynamics. So today I've suggested that we look toward longer histories of agricultural and indeed aquacultural property beyond national frameworks alone. Ideas of property have been entwined with colonial empire and cross-border transplantations of people, plants, and other organisms. This is also a part of complex settler colonial legacies within and beyond the formal Japanese empire. Using the 1970s plant patent movement as a jumping off point, I've tried to lay out a more complex history of plant variety protection across 20th century Japan. I do this with the realization that law, migration, and empire have limited a priori to either Japanese imperial or post-war Japanese contexts alone. I want to stress that while a Japanese institutional history of plant protection is important to understand and critique, I'm trying to approach histories of plants, people, and ideas in ways that don't presuppose their origins. Instead, we need to understand the conflicting aims of multiple figures, as well as histories of Asian and Trans-Pacific mobility and immobility. I found it vital to link questions of power to local and trans-regional contexts in ways that do not reduce the Trans-Pacific to US-Japan bilateral relations alone. Relatively high-profile cases like Kurakata Eizo's yellow peach serve as visible entryways onto less obvious relationships among people, plants, and the law, and the lands and waters where all have overlapped and at times come into conflict. So finally, if you're interested, I would direct you toward Jose Bellido and Brad Sherman's forthcoming Oxford University Press volume, Intellectual Property and the Design of Nature, where I have a chapter in which a kind of different version of this material will appear. But thanks very much for listening, and I look forward to continuing the discussion that follows. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ericson. And if I could ask everyone to join me in a virtual round of applause for Dr. Ericson, please. We'll get the technology up to speed to be able to do the round of applause at some point. I think maybe I can throw a reaction there. Okay, we've got plenty of questions. That was a fascinating and provoking talk. I'm going to start with perhaps one of the more technical questions. So could you tell us, please, whether the 1947 Agricultural Seeds and Seedlings Law and the 1952 Main Crop Seed Law was seen as types of intellectual property law?
It's a good question. I think at the time it was not, conceptually. However, people made comparisons, for example, to the Agricultural Seeds and Seedlings Law to trademark protections. Maybe I shouldn't say it too soon that they're considered totally separate, but I think my understanding is that while people saw similarities, that wasn't necessarily the framework in which they were thinking about it. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. Another question which you talked to, but perhaps you could give us a slightly tighter periodization. When did breeding come to be seen as a scientific or an industrial activity in Japan, if it is entirely viewed in those terms even today? And what sort of a uptake of scientific and industrial methods do you get on a plant-by-plant basis? So I'm assuming there's a very different story to be told for peaches to that being told for roses.
Okay, yeah, this is a great question that I fear I don't have a great answer to. I mean, we can go in multiple directions in addressing this kind of issue. One is, work on the history of genetics and plant breeding in sort of institutional contexts in early 20th century Japan. We could talk about the sort of intensification of agricultural experiment stations across, for example, the Japanese Empire and beyond, particularly, I would say in the 1920s and 1930s. I think what you'll find, as you suggested, is that if we look at different plant varieties, we'll find very different stories. I mean, to some extent, my interest, at least in this realm of research that I've been working on, has been more closely related to fruit trees and to some extent flowers as well. But even within that, it's hard to make sweeping generalizations. But it's definitely something to consider more.
There's an interesting point coming into the chat that maybe you can see as well, which is a good early example from Peter Matthews, is also Morning Glory, flower breeding in Edo period, Japan.
Let's see. Oh, sorry.
Gotten your attention to the chat, hopefully. Maybe you can see Hamish.
Okay, yes, I see both questions, yes. Yeah, excellent. So I mean, one issue in thinking about seed breeding is that, of course, we don't want to just sort of focus on the 20th century as like the starting point alone. So, we could think about, I mean, there's the sort of well-known seed company here in Kyoto is Taki, the fairly long-running seed company, which has its origins, it dates its own origins to about the 1830s. But of course, there's kind of various breeding practices happening actually in a very wide range across early modern Japan as well. So yeah, I think this is a great example here of flower breeding in Edo, Japan, which I think we can find various examples with vegetables and things like this as well. And let's see, there's the other question on, okay, so
traits versus varieties.
Right. Honestly, I'm not sure of the answer to that. It's a good question. I'm not aware of the range of those. Maybe somebody else can chip in on that.
So also coming in from the chat, we've got a question about to what extent was the farmer's privilege both enforced before the Monsanto bill and then curtailed as a response to the Monsanto bill. So what difference did the Monsanto make to the farmer's privilege?
It's a good question. I would say in terms of like formal legal enforcement, there's definitely been an intensification, or at least the prospect of an intensification in more recent years. I mean, in some ways, I mean, part of the big pushback to, for example, the end of the 1952 main crop seeds law and things like this that I mentioned is because, I mean, part of the rationale for this was to sort of maintain farmers' access to low-cost seeds and things of this nature. And of course, within that, the whole point was that we need to make things, kind of easier to access through a variety of means, and the sort of closing of those opportunities, I think, is leading to a wider range of fears from different corners of what sort of the future of sort of practical seed use will be, not just sort of plant variety protections in the abstract.
Excellent, thank you. I've got a question which circles back to the earlier question. So my question is about the labor of plant breeding. And to circle back to the earlier question, when do you start to see people who call themselves scientists doing the work of plant breeding? And a sub-question, so despite who is talking about doing the work of plant breeding, who is doing the work of plant breeding? So at that national level and in the nursery level, if you like.
Yeah, these are fantastic questions. I mean, certainly in terms of the people who are talking about doing the work of plant breeding in a sort of scientific mode. I mean, a few of the people that I already mentioned, and of course I didn't introduce all the members of the 1970s plant patent movement, but a few of the people that I mentioned who are sort of affiliated with it, Kihara Hitoshi, Shinohara Suteki, these are people who have training in sort of natural sciences, agricultural sciences, who get positions both in sort of commercial seed companies, but also in sort of agricultural experiment stations, universities. This is happening, with a sort of intensification in the 1920s and 1930s, to be sure. But then there's also the question of, yeah, where is this coming from? Who is actually doing this breeding work? And certainly this is something that I was quite interested in, certainly in this aspect of my research, when we think about someone like Kurakata Eizo, who I've talked about with the peaches. My suspicion is that he had employees and that he was not doing everything on his own, although his narratives of his sort of past hardships and successes, of course, emphasized himself as a kind of lone hero or martyr at different times. But I think there was some kind of workplace labor situation that I would like to kind of investigate more at a sort of broader scale, because I think this is a really important point.
We've got another question on labour, somewhat hidden labour. So the 1945 Seedlings Act, is there a system of trialling involved with this? Or is this done on paper? Is anyone out growing seeds and inspecting them?
Right. I mean, certainly
that labour being conducted? Sorry.
Yeah, I don't have a great sense of the sort of contact zone, if you will, kind of inspectors or verifiers, and then the kind of local growing sites and how these were interacting. The criticisms that were certainly being leveled from the 1960s and into the 1970s were that it was very much on paper. It was very, from their perspective, this was a very capricious, arbitrary system that did not benefit breeders, right? Which maybe one might expect from a movement that was sort of proclaiming kind of plant breeders' interests. But certainly, they were bringing up their bad experiences based on a lack of kind of on the ground interaction with what they were doing. That there weren't people actually saying, is this sort of like a good variety of fruit or whatever, that it was, there were certain decisions being made that, oh, okay, maybe this shouldn't even receive a registration in the first place. But of course, we have to take this with a grain of salt.
Thank you. We've got 2 more questions, if we can beg your time for just a few more minutes. So one question is, Very often the food news that we hear from Japan is about the aesthetics of food and the refinement of those aesthetics. For example, the square watermelon seems to have a cyclic appearance in British news stories. How did the plant protection system adapt to consumer preferences? Did it pretend to adapt to consumer preferences? I noticed that the peach is early.
It's a good question. To be honest, I don't have a great answer to that at the moment. I mean, certainly for someone like Kurakata, okay, which is maybe the example that I'm going to fall back on here. When he's trying to breed this yellow peach, he's thinking about something that's for mass consumption. He wants something that you can grow this anywhere, it's suitable for canning, and that you will then be able to store and eat, you know, potentially in Japan, but also potentially to be exported, you know, elsewhere. So I think it really, again, this goes back to that kind of caveat that I think it really would depend on which sort of plant variety we're looking at. And I think you would see some of those different pressures to make things more square or what have you. Or, you know, in some cases to make things sweeter, or, you know, there's all sorts of elements, of course, that go into this.
Thank you ever so much. Okay, I think final question for the day, and perhaps it's too big a question, so please feel free to comment as you see fit. Bringing in another player in Japanese agricultural context, to what extent does the Japan Agricultural Cooperative control seed supply and the choices of farmers? And to what extent does that cooperative structure ameliorate what's happening at the commercial and government sites?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, this is a really big question. It's sort of beyond the scope of what I've been doing in a way. I think partly it's not necessarily controlling seed supply and seed choices, maybe as much as maybe introducing certain varieties. I think there's also, I mean, again, I would probably defer to potentially other people in this audience, but I think there's also an element of other kinds of growers associations that are potentially geared towards you know, fruit tree breeding. There are all sorts of divisions of other associations that work alongside JA in different contexts that I think would also be involved in different kinds of you know, exhibitions and you know, introducing different varieties, and also potentially protecting varieties on collective levels, depending on the context. But yeah, it's a great question.
Thank you ever so much. I think that's about as much time as we can take from you today. Thank you ever so much for a fascinating and thought-provoking talk, which really spoke to so many of the themes which are familiar and dear to us as a research group. So I very much hope that we'll be able to see you in Queensland very soon.
I hope so too.
Much.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.